I found a comfort zone in idiocy that required no laborious effort or intellectual rigor. To crip or not crip was the question. To crip or not crip was not the question, it was the answer. To me, life after cripping, most of my time in the hole was spent driving iron, reminiscing and watching the Hypnotic Tube television. Over the prison airwaves, whether interested or not, I got an earful of uncut versions of revolutionary theories, religious doctrines, communist dogmas, and the Afrocentric philosophy. Though I could read, people were sending me literary material beyond my comprehension. It was akin to feeding a newborn baby solid foods. The attempt by some of them to wake me up was doomed to fail from the start. Intellectually, I was bankrupt, and as quickly as they passed books down to me, the faster I sent them back. No dogma was powerful enough to permeate my thick cranium, nor threaten my allegiance to Cripdom. I knew many hardcore Crips who played their role to the hilt, but I took it beyond the limit. Crip was my religion. I was the co-creator and the star-crossed prophet, and I critiqued all other Crips by my own standards. With a wary eye, I scrutinized individuals professing to be a Crip because I knew some were perpetrating fraud. Life as I remembered it would never be the same, nor would the Reverend Crip connection. Despite my lack of discipline and my underfed intellect, I recognized the imbalance in the institution's racial favoritism that boldly excluded all blacks except those who were informants on other blacks. The whole was the center of communal dysfunction. Quick and violent dramas contrasted sharply with gladiator tales told to me by Big Rock when I was a child. This was survival of the fittest. I was familiar with the requirements of that game. At that time, there were no mesh fences on the outer cell bars to hinder the use of a prison-made blow dart gun, a fashion spear, a match bomb, a zip gun, or simply but deadly dousing of scalding hot liquid consisting of syrup, battery acid, or whatever else was available. Usually when an incident occurred on the tier, I found myself blamed. In one instance, a death row snitch was being escorted down the tier by a female guard when a boiling hot concoction was thrown from one of the cells. The solution burned the inmate, and some of it landed on the guard, resulting in severe burns and a sick leave. A guard went on record stating, "I saw Williams' arms stretched out the cell bars. Then he threw some kind of liquid on the inmate." The accusation was false, absurd, and impossible, considering that my arms were too large to squeeze through the narrow bars. I filed a 602 appeal form. I was innocent, and I lost the appeal. Once I smelled smoke while writing the letter. Peering through the slits of the cell bars, I saw grayish-white smoke belching from a cell of an inmate who was out to court. The smoke began to hug the ceiling, then crept down the tier toward the front where I was housed. Within minutes, the entire tier was engulfed in smoke, and all the windows that were usually open were now shut. Along with Bub, Black, and Gigi, I hollered for the guard to open the windows, but for 15 minutes, my shouts were in vain. By the time the guards arrived, the entire tier had turned grayish-black, with thick soot floating in the air, covering the walls and everything else in the cell. The thick smoke had me blowing my nose and coughing up black mucus. Nauseated, I dropped to my knees and with my head inside the toilet and threw up. Emanating with each flush was a welcoming surge of air from my smoke-filled lungs. It was ironic. The breeze carrying the oxygen of life to my lungs was the same inimical gust of cold air beneath me whenever I used the toilet. When the guards finally opened up all the windows, they placed a giant fan on the tier to blow out all the smoke. In the back of each cell, the guards systematically used an oxygen tank with a mask held up against a square-shaped window and bars for whoever needed it. As I stood there inhaling fresh oxygen, I couldn't help wondering if this experience of morbid asphyxiation was a vile precursor to being gassed in the chamber. That evening, I actually thought all of us were going to die. It was a horrific reality I hoped never to undergo again under any circumstances. Despite these melancholy moments in the hole, I was able to hone my knowledge of prison interactions. I was becoming a student of sociology and psychology. owning my keen observation of others. People can be creatures of habit, and in significant ways it was necessary for me to be aware of such behavior. The parasitical environment was contagious, and I was infected, but occasionally conflict arose between cripping and an intrusive question. Where do I go from here? In retrospect, it was a moment of skepticism that challenged the crip reality I held more than anything. But at the time I was opposed to self-change or to anything I felt would diminish my crip image. I was always willing to aid a crip in distress. That was a given. But for some reason or other, that impulsive stupidity, I opted to assist another black man who was under siege by guards. I didn't know this death row prisoner, but it offended me to see one of the guards outside his cell preparing to shoot him with Big Bertha, a sawed-off shotgun that shoots a thick plastic wad that is painful to be stuck with. But it offended me to see one of the guards outside his cell preparing to shoot him with Big Bertha, a sawed-off shotgun that shoots a big, thick plastic wad that is painful to be struck with. If the guards used it, they would then rush in to seize the guy. I hollered loudly, "Why don't you cowards come down here and try to shoot me with that gun?" A sergeant shot back, "Who is that talking with the big mouth?" I said, "Stanley Williams, C29300. I'm in cell 58. Within seconds, there was a crowd of guards standing in front of the cell gawking at me. As the sergeant walked up, I heard him say, "Let me see who this big mouth is." I stood there with my shirt off and prepared for an attack. When the sergeant peered in at me, he said, well, look who we have in here. It's Tookie. What's the problem?" I spat out, "If you plan to shoot that black man down there, then prepare to shoot me right now." While the sergeant and I eyed one another, a guard in the crowd said, "Sarge, let's shoot him too." Looking at me, the sergeant told the guard, "Shut up. You don't know what's going on here." He then said, "All right, Tookie, we don't want to riot, but if we have to come back to deal with Coleman and you interfere, then you're going down too." "Fair enough," I responded. The next day while I was on the yard, a black man, Mahafali, hollered out from another one of the alleged black guerrilla family exercise yards, "Brother Tookie." That was a courageous gesture to stand up for that brother. "Black man, you should be proud." Mahafali was a thin, 6'3" spiritual revolutionary who was notorious for stabbing guards. I smiled and said, "Mahafali, it's nothing but a crip thing." He smiled and shook his head, knowing that all the revolutionary chats we engaged in had no effect on me. Every conversation we had was unilateral. He talked while I watched TV. Sometime later, the counselor who had threatened to keep me on grade B was transferred to another prison. With him out of the way, the classification committee restored my grade A status, and I was sent back to North Sag. Arriving there was like starting all over again as far as the weights were concerned. There were just 2 lightweight barbells and 1 set of 40-pound dumbbells. Once again, I filed a 602 appeal form. As a result, a stockpile of heavy barbells, dumbbells, and weight benches were brought up to death row. Within months, I was tying barbells on a 370-pound bar, more than 560 pounds total for doing reps. Occasionally, guards would show up on the opposite side of the gunrail fence and watch in amazement as I lifted the monstrous weight with relative ease. A few of them tried unsuccessfully to get approval for me to enter the San Quentin weightlifting contest. They had no doubt I'd win. Though I was driving iron on a regular basis, I was still bored. I took up drawing, which became a pleasant pastime. I began drawing animals and birds, then people. With no assistance, I developed a style enabling me to do pencil portraits of my mother, Martin Luther King Jr., Sojourner Truth, Malcolm X, Coretta Scott King, Frederick Douglass, Dorothy Hay, and others. Drawing in itself had a halcyon effect on me, like music, calming the beast within. It was a form of escapism. Hours flew by as I lost myself in the godlike power to create life on paper. It amazed me that a person like me could pick up drawing and actually succeed. In addition to lifting weights, it was a personal dexterity I relished. Another skill I discovered by serendipity was memorizing large numbers of words and their definitions. It frustrated me to be unable to comprehend legal terms and other words I came across while reading newspapers, magazines, and books. I was tired of skipping over certain words or having to stop and jot down a word to look up later on. In time, I started browsing the dictionary and became fascinated with the different words, definitions, and foreign phrases. In a short period, I developed a style of mnemonics and memorizing long lists of words written on one side of a sheet of paper, then folding it with the definitions on the opposite side. It became clear that the more words I retained, the better I was able to understand what I read. Months earlier, I had been given an old pocket-sized dictionary with most of the pages scotch taped together and missing.